Okay, so modernist art. It often received widespread criticism from the voices of the professional establishment as well as the public. Additionally, it was severely censored by political authorities across the world. Why was this? What threat could art have on a society or a government for that matter? Pablo Godo published an article titled "The Influence of Art on Common People," and this article looks at the different ways art can impact people by being a medium of communication. So basically, art can influence how people think or view the world. It can evoke feelings that words cannot describe. And with the onset of modernist art that included more abstraction, there can be underlying messages hidden in art. This is the reason why it is powerful and why totalitarian governments fear it, because it has potential to undermine the philosophy or values of a political system, even if that's not the artist's intent. So it is basically a threat to a government's legitimacy. What do I mean by this? Well, I mean that governments maintain their authority through two things: legitimacy and coercion. Sources of legitimacy include, things like elections, history, religion, international recognition, basically the factors that contribute to a country being seen as legitimate and why citizens are loyal to their country. Coercion is the use of force by government to protect their legitimacy, which is why governments were banning art. Legitimacy is important because governments want control of their citizens, especially concerning the ideas of modernism and why it is threatening. Modernism champions individualism and condemns herd mentality, Nietzsche, whereas totalitarian governments condemn individualism, they want herd mentality. And so modernist art encourages the subject to sense, think about what they are seeing, which is why it's threatening for certain governments. Governments are also aware that art influences thought and behavior, which is why totalitarian governments often promote propagandistic art that impose the values of the state on their citizens. With the underlying message of individualism in modernist art, this directly was not promoting the values of totalitarian states. This is the reason why it was banned in certain countries. One of these cases occurred in Russia with the rise of Stalin and the Soviet Union. Modernist art was being created and flourishing in the Russian Empire from the 1910s up until 1932, where the ideas of the avant-garde went against the socialist realism ideology of the state. Socialist realism was a style imposed on the state which focused on depicting and glorifying communist values. So here's a socialist realism painting. This is clearly displaying the message of the state. It's people working together. Everyone's equal, whatever. Meanwhile, here's a painting from 1910. It's clearly more abstract, allowing the subject to kind of sense. Still pretty clear what it is. It's two girls. And here's another Russian painting from 1920. This is even more abstract. But then suddenly we get a clear socialist ideology being presented through the artwork. Like, that's Lenin right there, sitting with peasants. Like, how more straightforward could you get? Like, how did Russian art go from this to this? It's just the work of the government. A similar instance of this occurred in Germany in the 1910s and 20s. Contemporary art flourished in Germany with widespread enthusiasm. There were even modern art museums and exhibits founded all over Germany. However, all this stopped with the rise of National Socialism and the onset of Nazi regime. Using Stephanie Barron's book Degenerate Art, The Fate of the Avant-Garde in Nazi Germany as a source, Nazi Germany forbade modern art in forms of artistic expression that did not promote purity and militarism, which were the ideologies of the regime. So the government used extensive coercive force by taking 1,600 pieces of art located in museums and exhibits all over Germany. They then organized probably the biggest attack on artistic expression in history when the state hosted a degenerate art exhibit. So this exhibit hastily hung up tons of modernist works as a way to mock the form, so people would go against modern art and be in favor of the art that the state was promoting. However, what happened was completely the opposite. People came to the exhibit and adored it as a way to almost rebel against the Nazi party. People traveled to Germany just to see the exhibit. In fact, way more people went to the degenerate art exhibit than the official German art exhibit, which was the artwork the state was promoting and advocating. This shows the extent to which art can promote socio-political messages that go against the state. And this type of attack isn't as direct as, say, Picasso's Guernica, which was directly targeted at the Spanish government for bombing a civilian town during the Spanish Civil War. While the artwork itself in the degenerate art exhibit is not attacking the state, it was the manner in which people rallied to this event and united as a means to reject the values of the art that the state was promoting. Additionally, after World War II, modern art was being created again in Germany as the state had to deal with the ramifications of the war. To quote Harvard Museum's excerpt on the matter, as Harvard are currently hosting an exhibit called Inventor on the art that came out of this era in Germany, the word inventor, inventory, implies not just an artistic stock-taking, but a physical and moral one as well. So this implies that art reflects the values of the state. Now that the ideas and philosophies of the regime changed, the art being promoted had to change as well. The moral stock taken correlates with the country abandoning their prior values that they held during the war and accepting the ulterior values and other values of modernist art. Look at this piece in the exhibit, for example, clearly abstract, individualism. People are going to see this and see different things. So the last case I want to talk about is China. And so the case for suppression China is a little different than the other two. Chinese art is actually the oldest tradition in the world and has remained somewhat uninfluenced by the Western world. For example, like modernism and like contemporary art movements weren't like in China, or at least they were not occurring at the same time as they were in the Western world, if that makes sense. However, there was a Chinese style of abstraction called guohua, which China's modern art schools taught, which incorporated European artist techniques into like traditional Chinese painting. It did it like this to distinguish it from the Western style. Using NewYorkEncyclopedia.org as a source, Chinese art was pretty free, altering between dynastic reigns, and this art even had a degree of continuity to it over China's long history, which is pretty crazy. For example, here's an ancient Chinese piece of art, and here's a Chinese brush painting from the 20th century, pretty similar. Here's another Chinese piece from the 1920s, which has some modernist elements to it, that kind of cubism-like features on the face, but still not very abstract. China then experienced a huge selective art decline with the rise of the Communist Party of China, with Mao Zedong heading the party in the 1950s. Similar to the Soviet Union, artists were encouraged to use socialist realism, and art was promoted if the government favored the message it was displaying, and on the contrary, if art conflicted with the Communist Party beliefs, artists were forced to undertake the re-education process of the regime and become farmers, or worse, I'm assuming. The art from this era was very propagandistic, with Mao's face being front and center to establish his cult-like following. Any sort of modernist work that relied on the individual to make meaning out of was strictly forbidden. In fact, China even chose to conduct their own cultural revolution, which was a revolution in China conducted at the top by Mao and the Gang of Four, where they encouraged younger generations to destroy older Chinese art and temples and whatnot. And this shows the extent to which the CCP would go to promote their communist and Maoist values over anything, even past China. So after Mao died, China experienced a redevelopment of art in the 1980s in the form of contemporary Chinese art as a sort of offshoot of modernist art. Like you see, this piece here is more contemporary. It's a lot going on. You can kind of see what's happening, but sort of up to the viewer to interpret. Government still cracked down on this kind of art in the 80s and 90s, but up until recently it's been more free, I believe. It's kind of difficult to tell. Although China still do suppress and censor well-known Chinese artists for being publicly against the state or outspoken, and the best example of this is Ai Weiwei, whose art is not concerning politics at all. You can see here it's not any sort of underlying political message, it's still contemporary, Yet he was imprisoned in 2011 by the Chinese government for 3 months for nothing. Anyways, a common theme amongst these states is the government's belief that they should decide which values are important to the people rather than the artists. This tactic was used throughout the 20th century to condemn the media and elite artists. In fact, this strategy is still seen today with politicians and even the current president of the United States, where they're dismissing or discrediting the media artists' opinions because they are elites. Anyways, art is important. It can shape our values, and often that is seen as a threat, especially for modernist art, as I clearly displayed. Thanks for watching.